Sawdust and coffee. That's the smell that used to mean home to me. 40 years of walking through my own back door at 6 in the evening with grease under my nails, and Ellen would already have the percolator going, and there'd be a pile of curled pine shavings on the garage floor from whatever she'd talked me into building that week. A spice rack. A step stool for the grandbaby who wasn't born yet. A porch swing she painted the color of a robin's egg because she said gray houses need something to argue with. Sawdust and coffee. The porch swing gappler. The sawdust. That was my whole life, and I didn't know it was the good part until it was over. 4 years after we buried her, on the second Saturday in June, I pulled my truck up the crushed limestone drive at a place called Kestrel Point on the Marblehead Peninsula, and what I smelled coming off Lake Erie was money. Cut grass and lake water and somebody's expensive candle burning out on a covered porch in broad daylight. And under all of it, my friend, I smelled something else. I smelled the same thing a man smells in a shop right before a chain lets go and a 2-ton engine block comes down. I didn't have a word for it. I just knew that whatever was waiting for me in that house had been waiting a long time, and that today was the day it had decided to stop being polite about it. I sat in the truck with the engine off for a full minute. My hands were on the wheel, and I was looking at them the way you look at somebody else's hands. 68 years old. 34 of them in the county bus garage, on my back on a creeper with brake dust raining in my eyes. The knuckles are swollen, and the nails don't come clean anymore, not with lava soap, not with anything. I'd scrubbed them that morning until the skin around them was raw and pink. I'd worn the good gray suit. I'd worn the silver tie bar Ellen gave me on our 25th. The one she had engraved on the back where nobody could see it, still my favorite mechanic. I checked the tie bar was straight. Then I got out of the truck and went to my granddaughter's blessing lunch. My son Dennis met me at the side door. 39 years old, my boy, and he looked like a man who hadn't slept properly since the Obama administration. There was a groove between his eyebrows that hadn't been there at Christmas. He hugged me a quick one, the kind where the chest doesn't quite make contact, and he said, "Dad." "Hey, great. You found it okay." I'd been to that house 11 times. And I said, "GPS took me right to it." "Great," he said again. He was already looking past my shoulder at the drive. "Great." Inside, the house was so clean, it didn't feel like anybody had ever been sad in it. White floors, white walls, a wall of glass looking out at the water, and furniture that all seemed to be daring you to sit on it. There was a hallway with framed black and white photographs of sailboats, and I remember thinking that somebody had paid actual money for photographs of boats they didn't own. My shoes were the wrong shoes. I'd polished them, but they were the wrong shoes, and I'd known that in my kitchen at 7 that morning and worn them anyway because they were the shoes I had. That's the thing nobody tells you about being the poor relation. It isn't that you can't afford the right thing. It's that you find out there was a right thing and that everybody else was born knowing it and that they've been quietly deciding things about you for years while you thought you were all just eating dinner. My daughter-in-law Sloane came around the corner with the baby on her shoulder. Nora, 8 weeks old, in a christening gown that had, I would learn later that afternoon, been worn by 4 generations of farriers. Sloane is a lovely-looking woman. I want to say that plainly because I think it matters. When Dennis first brought her to my house 9 years ago, she sat at my kitchen table and ate 2 helpings of Ellen's chicken and noodles and laughed at my jokes, and I thought, well, look at that. He did all right. "Walter," she said. She held the baby a little away from my suit. "You made it. Wouldn't miss it," I said. "Can I?" "In a bit. She's just gone down." She was already turning. "Mother's in the great room. Go say hello." "Mother." Marguerite Ferrier. She told me at the wedding to call her Margot, in the same voice you'd use to give a dog permission to sit on the good rug. And I'd never once managed to do it. 66 years old, silver blonde, a face like a hatchet that had been to a very good spa. Her late husband Preston had owned a chain of marinas from Port Clinton to Erie, Pennsylvania, and if you spoke to Margot for 11 minutes you would hear about all of them. She had a thing about the family name. Ferrier, she'd say, and then wait. Not Ferrier. Ferrier. She had gotten a genealogist to trace it to a village in Normandy, and she'd hung the coat of arms in a downstairs powder room where guests would have no choice but to look at it. She was on the white sofa with a glass of something pale in her hand and her sister Bitsy beside her, and she saw me come in, and her chin went up about a 1/4 inch. "Walter," she said. "Well, aren't you a sight?" Did you drive all the way up in that truck? I did. Bless your heart, all that way. She looked at Bitsy. He drives a pickup, she said, as though I'd arrived on a mule. Comes in handy, I said. I'm sure it does. Do you know, Bitsy, Walter is very handy. He's practically a professional handyman. I was a mechanic, I said. Diesel, county school buses, mostly, and the plow fleet in the winter. Yes, said Margot, and smiled at me with real warmth, the way you smile at a child who's told you the name of every dinosaur. That's what I said. Now here's where I want to be honest with you, because there's no point in telling this if I dress myself up in it. There was a second right then where I felt the old heat come up the back of my neck, and I had a sentence loaded and ready, and I looked across the room and saw Dennis standing at the kitchen island with a beer he wasn't drinking, staring down into it like there were instructions written on the label, and I swallowed the sentence. For him, that's the whole reason. I looked at my son's face and I thought, he's tired, and it's his daughter's day and I can eat this. I've thought about that moment more than any other. Every man's got a place where the road forks and he takes the quiet one because he thinks he's being the bigger person. Sometimes he is. And sometimes, my friend, all he's doing is teaching everybody in the room the exact price of walking on him, and they will write that number down. I took my beer out to the back deck to get some air, and that's where I found the best thing in that house. Grandpa, Owen came across the grass like a shot, 11 years old, all elbows, and they'd put him in a blazer and a clip-on tie, and he looked like a hostage. He hit me around the middle hard enough to slop my beer, and I didn't care one bit. Hey, bud, did you bring it? I had. In my jacket pocket, wrapped in a shop rag, was a carburetor float off a 1,978 Briggs & Stratton that we'd pulled out of a mower at my house in April, the two of us, on the concrete in front of the garage while the neighbor's radio played. Owen had wanted to keep it. I told him I'd hold it until he had a shelf. He turned it over in his hands like it was a moon rock. It's so light, that's the whole trick of it. Something that light tells a whole engine when to eat. That's so cool. I know it. There were maybe 40 people on that lawn, and the only one of them who was glad to see me weighed 90 pounds. That's not self-pity, it's just arithmetic. He walked me back inside talking a mile a minute about a robotics thing at school, and we sat down on the hearth together, and that's where I first noticed the tablet. It was propped up on the mantel against a bowl of hydrangeas, screen facing the room. On it was a grid of little squares, and in the squares were faces. Ants in Cleveland, a cousin deployed somewhere, with a cinder block wall behind him. And in the top left corner, big, because whoever set it up had pinned her, a very old woman in a high-back chair with an oxygen line at her nose. Constance, Margot's own mother, 91 years old, in a care residence outside Sarasota, too frail to fly north for her great-great-granddaughter's blessing. That's Grandma Connie, Owen told me. She can't come, so I'm running the call. Mom said it's my job. It records too, so people who missed it can watch after. That's a big job. I know, he said, very serious. I have to keep it charged and I have to turn it if something's happening. I want you to hold on to that, my friend. An 11-year-old boy, given the smallest and least important job at that party, and taking it more seriously than any adult in the building took anything. 10 minutes later, Owen knocked over a glass of orange juice. It went across the end of the white sofa and Margot came up off it like she'd been stung, and the room stopped. Owen went the color of a beet. Somebody got a towel. And Margot stood there with her arms folded and made him do the whole thing. Stand up straight, look at her, say the words. I'm sorry, Nana Margot, for spilling on your couch. And he didn't know what came after, and he was 11. His eyes went wet and he found it anyway, for not being careful. There, she said, that wasn't so hard, but we take responsibility in this family, Owen. That's what separates people. She sat back down. Sloan, I'd get somebody out here for that today, not tomorrow. Sloan said, Mother, it's juice, it's silk. Now, hold that too. Hold it right next to the other thing, because an 11-year-old boy was standing in that room holding both, and unlike every adult present, he was going to notice when they didn't match. They called us to eat at 1 o'clock. Long table on the covered porch, lake behind it, catering staff in black polos moving around the edges with trays, place cards, actual place cards. At a family lunch. I walked the length of it looking for mine and I didn't find it, and Sloane came up behind me and touched my elbow. Walter, we put you down at that end. With Trip, we had to keep the middle for the godparents and mother. It's a whole thing with the photographer. Down at that end. My son's daughter's blessing lunch, and I was down at that end, next to Sloane's brother Trip, who spent the first 15 minutes telling a man across from him about a boat slip in Vermilion and did not once turn his head in my direction. Owen tried to sit next to me and got moved. Sweetheart, you're up here by Nana. He looked at me and I gave him the nod that means it's fine, go on, and he went, and I watched him sit down next to that woman and go quiet in a way an 11-year-old shouldn't know how to go quiet. The food came. It was very good and I couldn't taste any of it. And Margot held court. She talked about the Harbor Point Yacht Club and the Lakeside Cotillion and the fact that in September they were giving her the Whitcomb Service Medal, which had only been awarded 11 times in 90 years, and which she mentioned 4 separate times in under an hour. She talked about how impossible it was to get anyone dependable to do work on the property anymore. And every so often she'd swing the conversation around to me like a boom coming across a deck. Walter would know about that. Walter, what do you charge for that sort of thing? Or were you salaried? I never know how it works. Salaried. County job. Pension? She said brightly. Yes, ma'am. How nice. Sloane, isn't that nice? It must be such a relief not to have to think about it. She turned back to me. Preston never had that luxury. Of course, when you build something yourself, nobody hands you anything. I said, no, ma'am, nobody ever did. That was the second time I took the quiet fork. And I want to tell you it was strength, but I'm not sure. Around the 20-minute mark, she asked me to pass the water pitcher. And when I did, she took hold of my wrist instead of the handle. She turned my hand over. Right there, in front of the table, she held my hand up like she was examining a fish she was thinking about buying. Look at these, she said, delighted. Bitsy, look. Every single face at that table turned toward my hand. That's not dirt, I said. That's 34 years. It goes into the skin. It doesn't come out. I'm sure it doesn't, she said, and let go, and wiped her palm on her napkin. Slowly, so that everybody saw her do it. And this is the part where a man is supposed to stand up. I know that. I've heard from a lot of you since, and I want you to understand that I know it. I'm telling you what actually happened instead of what should have. What happened is that I looked down the length of that table at my son. Dennis had his fork in his hand, and he was cutting a piece of chicken into pieces small enough for a bird, and he did not look up. He'd checked out somewhere around the soup. He checked out, I would guess, about 6 years before that, and I was only just now seeing it because I was finally sitting in the seat where the view was clear. Then I heard Margot say, somebody get Walter a plate he can take outside. He'll be more comfortable. I said, I'm comfortable here. The table went silent. It went so silent I could hear the ice in the pitcher settle. I'm sorry? I said I'm comfortable here. My voice came out lower than I meant it to. I'm a guest at my granddaughter's lunch. My son invited me. I'm going to finish my meal at the table. Margot's face went a shade of red I have only otherwise seen on a manifold. And she reached out and picked up her wine glass, a full glass of red. She just poured it and she turned her wrist over and emptied it into my lap. There's a sound a room makes. It isn't a gasp. Not really. It's 40 people's breath stopping at once, and then the little clatter of somebody's fork hitting china. The wine went down the front of that gray suit, across both thighs, and into the chair. It was cold. That's what I remember, that it was cold, and that my first thought wasn't anger at all. It was a stupid, small, embarrassed thought. This is my only suit. Oh, goodness. Margot said, to the table, not to me. My hand slipped. She set the glass down. Yolanda, could we get a towel down here, please? And could you find him something to eat out on the dock? I think he'd honestly be more comfortable. I sat there with my hands in the air, like a man being arrested. And here's the thing I've had to sit with. My right hand came down and it found the water pitcher, and it closed around the handle. I could feel the cut glass on my palm. And I could feel exactly how it would go, the arc of it, the shriek she'd make, the silence after. Every man in the room would have understood it. A good number of them would have said I was owed it. But Owen was 7 feet away with his mouth open. So I let go of the pitcher. Not because she didn't have it coming, my friend. I want to be clear about that. because I know some of you would have poured it right back, and I've never once thought less of you for saying so. I let go because my grandson was watching, and I'd be damned if the last thing that boy learned from me was how a Kessler settles up. I stood. Wine ran off the hem of my jacket onto their floor. I said, "Dennis." He looked up at last. His face was white. "Are you going to say anything?" And my son, 39 years old, 6'1", a man I taught to change a tire in the rain when he was 14, my son looked at his wife. He looked at his wife first. He watched Sloane give a very small shake of her head, and then he looked back at me and he said, "Dad, come on, just let it go, please. It's Nora's day. Just apologize to Margot and sit down, and we'll get you cleaned up." Apologize. I have been hit by a falling transmission jack. I have had a wrench slip and take the top off 2 knuckles. I have stood in a funeral home in February and picked out a casket. And nothing in my life has ever gone through me the way that word did, coming out of my son's mouth, in that house, with my clothes soaked through. She poured a glass of wine on me. I said, "You embarrassed her, Dad." "Say that again." "You embarrassed her." He was almost whispering it. "You know how she is. You could have just gone outside for 10 minutes. It's 10 minutes, and you had to make it you always have to make it a thing." Margot folded her napkin. "Frankly, Walter, if you can't behave at a table, I don't know what you expected. And I'll thank you not to raise your voice in my daughter's home. Or shall I have somebody walk you to your truck?" Nobody moved. 40 people. Somebody's phone was face up on the table, and nobody was even looking at that. Bitsy was studying the tablecloth. Tripp had leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed and, God help him, he was enjoying it. I saw the corner of his mouth. I said, "No, ma'am, I know the way." And I turned and I walked down the porch steps and out across that lawn toward the water, dripping, with the whole table behind me, and I made it about 12 steps before my eyes went. I kept going anyway. I went all the way out onto the dock and sat down on the bench at the end of it with my back to the house. 9 years earlier, I'd rebuilt that dock. The ice had heaved the cribbing out of True the Winter. Dennis and Sloane got engaged, and I drove up on a Friday in April with my own lumber and my own tools, and I spent 2 weekends in water up to my knees resetting it, and Preston Ferrier came out on the 3rd day with a beer and said, "You're a good man, Walt," and I have never in my life been prouder of a compliment. I sat on that bench I built and I thought, I'm going to go home. I'm going to drive back to Fostoria and get out of this suit, and I am never coming back here. Not for Christmas, not for anything, and I will find some way to see my grandkids that doesn't cost me this. And then, because life is not tidy, I remembered my keys were on the counter by the kitchen door. So I walked back up, and that is the only reason I was in the room for what happened next. I came in through the side door, and the party had unfrozen into that awful busy hum of people pretending. Somebody had put music on. Sloane was talking too loudly to Bitsy. And I was reaching for my keys when I heard a chair scrape on the porch, hard, and a boy's voice come out over the top of everything. "Mom." Owen was standing up. He had both hands flat on the table and he was shaking. "Owen, sit down, honey." "Mom." Louder. His voice cracked in the middle of it. "Grandpa's clothes are all wet." "Owen." "Sit down." She did it on purpose. He wasn't crying yet, but it was coming. You could hear it stacking up behind the words. I saw her. She did it on purpose, and everybody saw and nobody said anything. Margot said, in that flat blade of a voice, "Owen, this is not your business, and you are being extremely..." And my grandson turned and looked straight at his mother and said the sentence. I spilled juice and I had to say sorry to her twice. His chin was going. "Mom, why is it okay when she does it?" And, that's it. Nobody had an answer for that. I want you to understand that there was no answer. Not one that could be said out loud in front of 40 people. That's what a child does that a grown man can't. He doesn't argue. He just holds the two things up side by side and makes you look at them. We take responsibility in this family. That's what separates people. She'd said it herself, in that room, 90 minutes earlier, to an 11-year-old, over orange juice. And then Owen did his job. He reached up and he took the tablet off the mantel, the one nobody had thought about in 2 hours, the one that had been sitting there facing the room the entire time with its little grid of faces, and he turned it around toward the table and he said, "Great-Grandma Connie's still on. She's been on the whole time. Everybody's been on the whole time. I have never seen a room change the way that room changed." Margot's face came apart in stages. First, she didn't understand. Then she understood the tablet was there. Then, and you could actually watch it arrive, like weather crossing water, she understood that it had been there since noon. That every word about my hands, and the truck, and the pension, and somebody get Walter a plate he can take outside, had gone out live to her sisters, her nieces, her cousin in Cleveland, the Kindland, a nephew on a base in Germany, and to her mother. Constance's voice came out of that little speaker thin and clear, and the porch was so quiet that everybody at that table heard a 91-year-old woman say, "Marguerite, what have you done?" Sloane made a sound, and got up so fast her chair went over backward. She went for the tablet and Owen stepped back with it against his chest, and she stopped, because there were 40 people watching and about 30 more on the screen. "It records," Owen said. He was crying properly now. "You told me it records. For the people who missed it." That's when Yolanda spoke. The server, black polo, hair up, maybe 50 years old, and she'd been standing against the porch rail with a tray in her hands through the whole thing. She said, "Ma'am, I saw it too." Her hand didn't slip. Margot rounded on her. "You are staff." "I know what I am," Yolanda said. "I saw it anyway. I stood there in the doorway with my keys in my hand and my pants soaked through. And my son finally got up out of his chair. Said, 'Dad,' he said. 'Oh, God. Dad, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know what I—'" "Sit down, Dennis." He sat down. He sat right down. I think that's the saddest sentence in this whole story. And I've told it 100 times now. I looked at Margot Ferrier. She had one hand at her collarbone and her eyes were going around that porch like a bird in a garage, and she was already trying to find the version of this she could survive. I could see her running the numbers on it. I said, "You wanted me to eat outside. You were right about one thing. I don't belong in here. I never did, and I've spent 9 years pretending I couldn't tell, and that's on me." Then I said, "I built that dock you're all going to take pictures on. Free. In April. In water up to here. You've walked on it 100 times." And then I said the only thing I had left. "Owen, come here, bud." He came. He came around that table so fast he clipped a chair, and he hit me around the middle exactly the way he had 2 hours before, except this time I was wet and he didn't care about that either. I got down so we were eye to eye. "You listened to me. You did a hard thing in a room full of grown people who wouldn't. You did the right hard thing. If anybody in this house tries to tell you different, you call me. You've got my number. Anytime, day or night. You understand?" He nodded. He couldn't talk. I put my hand on his head, and I picked up my keys, and I went home. "Now let me ask you something, my friend, and I'd truly like to know, because I've turned it over 1,000 times. If you'd been at that table, one of those 40 people with a fork in your hand, would you have said something? Or would you have looked at your plate like I watched every last one of them do? And, be honest, I'm not sure. I know what I'd have done if it had been somebody else's father. What happened next happened faster than I was ready for. I didn't post anything. I want that on the record because a lot of folks assumed I did. I never touched it. That recording lived in a shared family album that Sloane herself had set up, and by 9 o'clock that night it had been watched by 130 people who were all, one way or another, related to Marguerite Ferrier. It never needed to reach a stranger. It only needed to reach her people, and it did, before the dishes were dry. Bitsy called me at 11 that night, crying, and said she should have stood up and she'd been afraid of her sister her whole life. Constance's care home called me on Monday because the old woman had asked them to place the call herself, and she said, "Mr. Kessler, I raised her. Whatever's wrong with her, some of it's mine. I'm sorry. 91 years old. That's a woman with more spine than the entire back porch put together." On Tuesday morning I drove down to the sheriff's office in Port Clinton because I'd sat up 2 nights with it and I wanted to know. A deputy named Hollis took me into a side room and listened to the whole thing and watched about 90 seconds of the recording on my phone. He said, "Mr. Kessler, I want you to hear this from me because I don't think anybody's told you. Somebody pouring a drink on you deliberately, that's not a rudeness. In Ohio, that's offensive physical contact. It can be charged. You have every right to file, and if you file, I'll write it up today." I sat with that a long while. I'll tell you what went through my head. Owen went through my head. A courtroom, and a lawyer asking an 11-year-old boy to describe what he saw his grandmother do, and that boy having to carry the weight of what came after. I said, "Write the report. Everything. Her name, my name, the wine, what she said. I want it to exist. But I'm not going to press it." You're sure? "No," I said. "But it's what I'm doing. I have that report in a folder in my kitchen. Some of you are going to think I was a fool not to press. And I've heard from plenty who'd have done it. And maybe you're right. And what I know is that I wanted the truth written down by somebody official more than I wanted her in a room with my grandson." I also called a lawyer, a woman named Angela Boone out of Fremont, and she sent one letter, a demand for the cost of the suit, a written apology, and a formal acknowledgement of what occurred. $410 and a piece of paper. That was the whole ask. They paid the $410 within a week. The apology took 9. The Whitcomb Service Medal did not get awarded in September. The Harbor Point Yacht Club's board watched 2 minutes of that recording, and the letter they sent her was 3 sentences long. The Lakeside Cotillion Committee thanked her for her years of service and did not invite her back. She was not run out of town. She did not lose her house. No reporter ever knocked on her door. It was quieter than that, and I think quieter is worse. She simply stopped being invited to things by people who had spent 20 years pretending not to notice what she was, and who now had it on video and couldn't pretend anymore. She has not, to my knowledge, ever admitted she did it on purpose. She has told at least 4 people that I made a scene at a christening. Dennis called me 106 times in 6 weeks. I counted, not on purpose. I didn't answer, and I want to explain why, because it wasn't spite. It's that every single voicemail was about him. How bad it looked. What Sloane's family was saying. 1. Whether I'd tell people it was a misunderstanding, and Dad, please, this is going to follow me. Not once in 6 weeks did that boy leave a message that started with, "I'm sorry I told you to apologize." He was sorry it got out. Those are different things, and at 68 I have finally learned to tell them apart. In late July, he showed up at my house alone. No Sloane. He stood in my driveway next to the mower Owen and I had pulled the carburetor out of, and he didn't come inside for a while. He said, "I've been trying to figure out when it started." I said, "The first Christmas." She told me the pie was very homemade, and I laughed and you laughed and neither one of us said anything. He stood there, a long time. Then he said, "I let her make me somebody who doesn't stand up for his own father, and I did it in 10-second pieces so I never had to notice." That's the truest thing my son has ever said to me. It's not forgiveness. It's not a movie. He didn't earn anything back that day and I didn't hand him anything. But it was real, and after 6 weeks of 106 voicemails about him, it was the first real thing. Here's what I told him I needed, and it was only one thing. Not an apology. Not money. Not for him to cut anybody off. I said, "Owen is not to be punished. Not now, not sideways, not in 6 months, when everybody's calmed down. And I want every other Saturday, in writing, in the custody arrangement, in an email, in something I can hold because I have learned what happens to a grandfather who has nothing but goodwill and other people's memory." He got out his phone right there in my driveway and typed it and sent it to me and copied Sloane, 9:42 on a Tuesday morning. I still have it. They didn't take Owen's phone. They didn't ground him. Sloane sat him down and told him he'd done the right thing in a hard way, which is about as close to the truth as that woman has ever gotten, and I'll take it. He came the second Saturday in August, and we put a new fuel line on the Briggs, and it fired on the 4th pull, and he yelled loud enough to bring the neighbor out. In September, I got an envelope in the mail with my address printed in 11-year-old handwriting that leaned downhill. Inside was a photograph he'd taken with a disposable camera from a school project, me on my knees in the driveway, mower on its side, the sun coming in low, and a note on lined paper. He wrote that he was sorry his mom's family was like that. He wrote that his grandma Connie sends him letters now too, which surprised me and shouldn't have. And at the bottom, underlined twice, he wrote, "I would do it again even if I got in way more trouble." I've got that photo on the refrigerator. Underneath it, on a little hook, hangs the silver tie bar. I had the suit cleaned twice and the stain never came out of the trousers, so I donated the jacket and kept the bar, and the funny thing is I used to think of it as the only nice thing I owned. It isn't. It never was. Still my favorite mechanic. She knew exactly what she was buying when she had that engraved. and it took me 4 years without her and one wrecked afternoon on Lake Erie to finally read it right. Because here's what I learned at 68 years old, and I'd have paid a lot more than a suit for it. Money buys the table. It buys the house and the place cards and the photographs of boats you don't own. It has never once, in the history of this country, bought a person the manners to sit at that table like a human being. Marguerite Ferrier had every advantage a woman can be handed, and she still couldn't manage to be decent to a man who'd fixed her dock for free. And my grandson, who is 11 and owns nothing but a bicycle and a carburetor float, was the only person in that house with a shred of class in him. The wine didn't hurt. I want you to know that. What hurt was my son looking at his wife before he looked at me. What healed it wasn't the yacht club or the lawyer or any of it. It was a boy standing up on shaking legs at a table full of grown people and asking the one question they couldn't answer. Sometimes the smallest person in the room is the only one still tall enough to see over the lie. So tell me, friend, I mean it, I read every one of these. Should a father ever forgive a son who stood by and watched? I'm still working on my answer. And wherever you're listening from tonight, your kitchen, your truck, your porch, say the name of your town for me, would you? I'd like to know who's out there, because I found out the hard way that the people who love you and the people who share your last name are not always the same 40 people, and it's a hell of a thing to learn at a baby's blessing lunch.